Welcome back. Years of headlines about the war in Ukraine mask a deeper narrative of historical pain, cultural fortitude, and identity battle. A new book unveils this story through the lived experience of the war's victims, the exiled, the suppressed, and the rebellious. Central to this narrative are neglected indigenous voices guiding Ukraine's journey to rediscovery and self-governance. Joining us is the cultural anthropologist and teaching professor at the University of Michigan, Dr. Greta Uehling. Doctor, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks for having me. I'm really happy to be here.
Of course. Now, to start things off, just for our viewers, let us know, what is this book about?
So, Decolonizing Ukraine takes its readers into the lives of the Ukrainians, Russians, and Crimean Tatars that experienced the Russian occupation of Crimea in 2014. And I focus in particular on the Crimean Tatars because I feel like their experience really offers a unique and valuable vantage point on the war in Ukraine as a whole. And so if I was going to describe sort of like the arc of the book as a whole, I would say that it tells the story of a group of people who had been demonized and vilified for centuries, in past centuries even viewed as like the Ukrainians' arch enemies. How did they make the shift from being these marginalized people to being seen as valued partners in Ukraine? It's a really remarkable story, and I come to the conclusion that basically there were three things. First, collectively grieving mutual losses. Second, identifying the common values, right? The values that the Crimean Tatars and the indigenous people shared. And that main value is freedom. And then finally, courage, right? Like the courage to surmount the fear of a regime, namely Russia, that basically operates by inculcating fear as a way to secure compliance.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you for sharing that. Now, can you let us know what inspired you to tell these stories?
I am very inspired by philosophers, civil rights activists, and MLK is well known to have said that injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And that really resonates with me because I'm very committed to elevating the voices of people. And as an anthropologist, right, what happens when you're an anthropologist is you participate in people's lives. And there's like an intersubjective process in which their problems become yours and yours become theirs. And through participating in the lives of people, you come to care deeply about them, and also it really shapes your intellectual commitments. And I think a third reason, in addition to like my philosophy and my methodology of cultural anthropology, is really that, there's coming to be like a pretty big literature on the Russian war on Ukraine, but much fewer and farther between is really any accounting of the role of the indigenous people. And this is particularly striking because, first of all, they've taken such a leadership role in resistance to Russian aggression, but also because of their history in the region, right? Because one of the biggest myths of the Russian Federation is that Crimea is historically Russian. And if we actually look at that history, what becomes apparent is that prior to Russia's first colonization of Crimea in the 18th century, Crimean Tatars were not only the vast majority, over 90% of the population, but they had a fully fledged state. Their language was the lingua franca, and it was really only as a result of concerted policies, first by the Russian imperial regime, then by the Soviet authorities, and in the final stages by the authorities of independent Ukraine prior to Russia's occupation of Crimea that balance shifted and that they became a minority, right? It was a direct result of like a series of policies.
Right, absolutely. Again, thank you for sharing. And now I kind of want to touch on, before we get into the topics of the book, where are we today?
Oh, well, this week, Ukraine launched a counteroffensive that damaged the Kerch Bridge. So this is the bridge that brings military supplies from Russia into Crimea, which has become quite a military staging ground for Russia's operations against Ukraine. And they also did a stealth bombing of dozens of the planes that Russia had been using to bomb Ukraine. So I think the accounting was something like $7 billion worth of damage, a third of the fleet that Russia had been using. And so President Zelensky called it a brilliant operation. And the reason that it's important, of course, is that negotiations have failed to bring the war to a close. And it's really only, Ukraine being in the position to meaningfully defend itself that the war can come to a close.
And so let's talk a little bit about certain topics that are mentioned here in the book. What I want to start with is, how has Russia historically portrayed the Crimean Tatars, and what impact has that had on public perception and policy?
That's a great question. And, I would say that Russia has always taken a settler colonial approach to Crimea and Crimean Tatars. Settler colonialism differs from ordinary colonialism in the sense that they don't just seek to extract resources from Crimea or gain access to, say, agricultural land or warm water ports. They also seek to replace the existing population with their own. And we saw that after the 18th century imperial colonization of Crimea. But even as recently as, since 2014, Russia has moved massive numbers of Russians into Crimea, again, shifting the demographic balance in favor of Russians, and that then provides like a justification, right? A logical justification for them to be there. With regard to the Tatars, there's a very direct through line of viewing the Tatars as potentially disloyal. And we saw that during the Crimean War, where small things led to big rumors, and they were accused of being responsible for Russia's military defeat. And then it basically, there's a through line of them being seen as kind of a potentially disloyal group.
Right. Right. And so you kind of mentioned balancing things in one's favor. So let's talk about how Russian propaganda affected relationships and communities in occupied territories, particularly in Crimea.
Do you mean like after the 2014 occupation?
Yes.
Well, okay, so I guess it's helpful to know that Russia's approach to controlling territory is only partly military.
Right.
They control territory as much by influencing how people think about things as militarily, with tanks and armaments. And so they have a very hybrid approach that includes disinformation along the lines that it's historically Russian, but also that takes us into their quite draconian repression of anybody who had pro-Ukrainian views. Now, they occupy Crimea at a time when it is legitimately the territory of Ukraine. But anybody who was pro-Ukrainian or wished to remain part of Ukraine was deemed an enemy, a traitor, right?
Yeah.
Treasonous. And so they have a very black and white approach. There really is no space for a difference of opinion. Anybody who does not share their opinion is wrong and needs to be punished or corrected.
Right. Again, thank you for sharing. And now, your book touches on settler colonialism. How does Russia's occupation reflect the colonial model, particularly in a way that it treats indigenous people like Crimean Tatars?
Well, a little while ago, I was mentioning that the Crimean Tatars have been disproportionately affected by the Russian occupation of Crimea, and that's what that looks like, is that they are basically targeted for arbitrary arrest, imprisonment, and torture.
Right.
So they're being physically disappeared or imprisoned and moved out of the peninsula to regions that are prisons that are very, very, very distant. If Crimean Tatars today comprise 12 to 13% of Crimea's population, right? They dwindled from that over 90 figure to 12 to 13%. They comprise an estimate over 50% of the political prisoners in Russia today. So that's what I mean by being disproportionately targeted by the current Russian, the de facto authorities in Crimea.
Absolutely. And I do want to ask, if international support for Ukraine falters, especially from countries like the US, what would that mean for communities like the Crimean Tatars?
Well, it would be catastrophic, and I think that it would also lead to more war, right? Because as I mentioned, Crimea is a staging ground, and that means that failure to regain it will simply perpetuate war, and Crimea will continue to be a staging ground for other wars. You know, I don't think that Russia's imperial ambitions can be satisfied with negotiation, appeasement, any of these lesser measures. And so the swiftest and least costly way to contain Russian aggression is to regain Crimea. It's difficult, but it's not impossible.
Right. And prior to taping, you had mentioned discussing, what are some things that Americans are missing?
You know, I think that Americans usually hear about Russian aggression against Ukraine, and they don't realize how much they share with especially with modern Ukrainians. I think the first thing is, like, most people in the United States would be aware of the Trail of Tears, right? And the Soviet authorities had a similar approach to the Crimean Tatar population in 1944 of physically removing every single one of them from Crimea to places of exile in Siberia and Central Asia. So it's kind of like, it's also, I guess an analogy could be drawn to the internment of the Japanese, right? They were just put in camps. People were afraid that they weren't going to be loyal. They were put in camps with a tremendous cost. So the numbers are still being debated, but between 20 and 40% of the population perished as a result of that wholesale deportation during the Soviet era. So there's a very strong parallel between the way the United States treated its indigenous people and the way the Crimean Tatars were treated by successive regimes that had power in Crimea. That's one parallel. But then I think that there's also another parallel that can be drawn between the Crimean Tatars movement to gain full political subjectivity as Ukrainian citizens and the civil rights movement in the United States, right? So I draw a lot on, for example, James Baldwin, right, who said that the Black American experience can show something about United States that it otherwise couldn't see. And the same is true for Crimean Tatars, because we haven't really spoken a lot about Ukraine, but Ukraine is really only part way in the process of recognizing indigenous rights. So unlike Russia, Ukraine has recognized Crimean Tatars as indigenous. They've recognized that the 1944 deportation was a genocide, but there's still a lot of steps that can be taken. And so when we talk about, like, Ukraine has embarked on this process to disentangle itself from Russian aggression, to decolonize itself and gain this colonial and to gain cultural, political, epistemic agency for itself. And that will probably be, familiar to you, right? But what's unique about Ukraine is that it also has this other task in front of it in terms of recognizing its own past oppression of its indigenous people, right? So it's a sort of a nested colonialism that needs to be addressed over time.
Absolutely. Doctor, I want to thank you so much again for sitting down with us, and thank you so much.
Thank you.